Welcome to everyone who's joining us on our Just Energy for All webinar on bringing environmental justice and people power into the electoral process. My name is Elka Vega, and I'm the executive for economic and environmental justice with United Women in Faith. This previous position was held by Liz Lee, who you might be familiar with, and she has transitioned as our director for mobilization and advocacy. We're very thrilled to have you join. And now I'm going to share some poll questions to see who's with us today and get us started. So let me go ahead and share those poll questions with you. And they will be asking you, should be showing up on your screen now. If you're a member of United Women in Faith, we would like to know what your jurisdiction is, if you know it, if you have participated in previous United Women in Faith Just Energy for All trainings or webinars or working groups. And then we have a couple of extra questions today as well. We would like to know if you are registered to vote, or if you know if you are registered to vote. And if you're planning on voting, which we hope everyone's saying yes, on the coming US elections. And we have multiple choice there. And please disregard the last question. We were not able to change that one in the background, but happy to happy to see people are responding to our last questions as well. But thank you for your answers, and I'll be sharing those the results from our poll in a little bit. So just for please continue to introducing yourselves in the chat as well, sharing your name, where you're joining us from today, and the original indigenous inhabitants of your land where you live. Right now, I'm in Mexico City, so we have the Mexicas here and a wide number of indigenous peoples, but I'm originally from El Paso, and that's Tiwa land. And if you don't know, we're the original indigenous peoples in your county or city where you're joining us. You can find that at native/land.ca. And we'll be writing that on the chat. Huck, let me know if you're able to share that so you can look it up yourself and join that. You can also include your affiliation with United Women in Faith if you have a role. And again, feel free to include your pronouns as well. And let me see if I can share my polling results with you all so that you can see it from your end as well. Seems like we have a large number of United Women in Faith members. So thank you for those answering the poll to see where it happened. And we can see also the introductions in the chat. Thank you all for joining us from all different conferences and jurisdictions. Very excited to have you all with us today. Oh, okay, so I can continue sharing later on the script. So just a quick reminder of our Sisterhood of Grace norms of how to behave with each other in this space. Please listen actively with our heads and hearts. Speak from your own experiences. We're going to be aware of our body language. Respect the confidentiality of the circle. What is shared here stays here. Own your intentions and your impact, practice sustainability, and expect unfinished business and have both discomfort and joy. We're challenging each other to grow, and so this is part of the learning and unlearning process. So a quick agenda as well. I'm sorry, opening prayer. Right now we will have Ms. Cynthia Willis from the Mississippi United Women in Faith Conference open us in prayer. Ms. Cynthia is a retired educator who taught for more than 25 years and has been an active United Women in Faith member for more than 35 years. She has also held several offices in the district and the local unit, and she presently serves as a district treasurer and a local president. Thank you, Ms. Cynthia, for opening us in prayer today. And we can spotlight Ms. Cynthia.
That's not a register.
Thank you very much. Let us bow. God, the creator of all things, we come to you this afternoon, first giving thanks for your grace and mercy. We pray that the persons gathered on this Zoom call are people of true commitment and that our efforts are pleasing to you. Lord God, please be with us as we address the needs of all your people and in our Savior's holy name. We pray. Amen. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you very much, Miss Cynthia, for that beautiful prayer. And now we will have our agenda overview. So next we will have, I'll share some more about our speakers and our spiritual grounding. And then we will have Ms. Brenda Gillett, former legislator and social action chairwoman for the Arkansas Conference in United Women in Faith, share with us, followed by Gayla Tillman from Georgia Interfaith Power and Light in Atlanta. And they will be talking to us about protecting our common home through voting. And then I'll share too on how we can engage our United Women in Faith members and mobilize in our spaces for advocacy, followed by some Q&A for all of our speakers. And then we'll have Ms. Jody Helvinson close us in prayer. So we can go ahead and do a little bit of our spiritual grounding. So you might be asking yourself, if we can go to the next slide, thank you. So just as I said, I'm the Executive for Economic and Environmental Justice with United Women in Faith, previous one if possible. And today we're here to talk about how to engage in our electoral process, something that is very important. And you might be wondering, what are we talking about voting as United Women in Faith? And we, as in our United Methodist Book of Resolutions, we declare. If someone can mute themselves over there, even if it's echoing on my part, that will be. We declare that our ultimate alliance is with God and Scripture, but we recognize our faithfulness requires political engagement by the people of God, and that's in our Book of Resolution, number 5012. And we believe in the separation of church and state, but that should not be misconstrued as the abolition of all religious expressions from public life. Indeed, we have a responsibility to be active in our civic engagements of people of faith, as we believe that there's no holiness without social holiness, and that requires that we are strong advocates for a just and peaceful world. So with that, I just want to go ahead and now welcome Ms. Brenda Gillett, our speaker, educator, and former legislator, and as I said, social action chairwoman for Arkansas Conference of United Women in Faith. She's a certified lay speaker, and she teaches women's Bible studies on a regular basis, and as the chair of the Arkansas Conference General Commission on Race and Religion. And she has also served in the Arkansas Senate and the House of Representatives and on the Jefferson County Quorum Court. So thank you so much, Brenda, for joining us today. We're very excited to have you join us and share with us.
Well, thank you so much. And it's such a privilege to be here, always to be connected with United Women in Faith is such a big part of my life and such a big blessing in my life. So I'm really happy to be able to share. Well, a little bit about the story is I have appeared on the ballot 10 times over my political career, everything from school board to the House to the Senate to also the Quorum Court, which is the legislative body for the county. And then I took temporary leave of my senses and ran for mayor in my last race, which thankfully I lost. But anyway, it was a great experience. And so I have learned a little bit about voting and patterns of people voting and turnout and all those sorts of things. So I'm happy to share some of that experience with you, hoping that it will be helpful. But I just want to say it was always such an honor to represent my friends and neighbors and community in government. And when I was in the House of Representatives and the Senate, I had to always ascend a very tall stairway to get to my first committee meeting or to my office. And always, as I was ascending, I would say Psalm 19:14. I prayed that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart would be acceptable to God, my strong, impenetrable strength. Because it's very difficult to serve in public office. And even as I'm trying to encourage us today to vote more and to be more engaged, we are told in the scriptures that we are to pray for those who are in leadership and who are in roles of responsibility. So as Christian women, we have a tremendous responsibility, I think, to do that. Also, about my political party, I will not divulge it here, but it won't be long into my speech. You'll probably figure it out. But I became a Christian, accepted Christ into my life as my Savior when I was very young, 9 years old. And so I was a Christian for many, many years before I selected a political party. And that had a great deal to do with the party that I chose, because I felt that it lived out my overall values as a Christian, as opposed to some of the other choices that I had. And I'll tell you, during the majority of my political years, I was not a United Methodist. And I am so sorry about that, because if I would have had the social principles there in my briefcase, that I could have whipped it out and said, I oppose a lot of things that are going on because this reason. And about principles. So I truly value now and wish that I would have had to fall back on whenever I was in the legislature. But I started off running for the quorum court, which in Arkansas, that is the legislative body for the county. And it is part-time, and you meet and you have committees and you oversee the legislation of the county and land use and waste management and all sorts of things. And so back then I had 2,500 voters in my district. So I was able to go down to the courthouse. I spent 3 days and I turned and looked at every voter registration that was in my district. And I will never forget how shocked I was to see that many people that were leaders in our community only voted every 4 years, because they only thought that federal and presidential elections were important, of course, for senators every 6 years. But I was very discouraged by that. And it made a real impression on me. Of course, a caveat was if you registered to vote back then, you automatically went into the pool for having to serve in jury duty. That has changed now. It's usually by your driver's license, but that's the reason a lot of people gave for not being involved in the process. Well, I was going door to door and it was hot and it was on a Sunday afternoon and this lady was backing her car out. And I said, oh, good afternoon. I didn't mean to scare you. I'm Brenda Gullett. I'm running for the quorum court and I would really like to have your vote. And she said, oh, honey, I'm sure you are such a nice person. But she said, I don't worry myself about that. She said, now, I only worry about senators and congressmen and presidents. And I said, well, I understand that. And I do not want to take up unnecessarily your time, but may I just make a comment? And she said, well, of course, what is it? And I said, well, if you will check the resumes of most congressmen and senators and other elected officials in the government, federal government, you will see that 95% of them started out on city council, school board, quorum court, or city board, and they were on their way because the power of the incumbency is very strong. And you know that if you've ever run against an incumbent or supported someone who did. Once you get elected, you're on your way many, many times unless you just absolutely mess up. And I said, if you took the time to weed out the bad apples at this level, you would have a greater assurance of people that you're sending to Washington. She went, I never, ever thought about that. Give me those papers. And so I may have had a convert there, but it's absolutely the truth. And that's what I want to focus on today is local elections, not federal, not state, but local elections. And why? Historically, only 15 to 27% in our country vote in local elections. And the problem with that, it's less representative of the demographics of our community that we really say we're trying to reach out to and include. Fortunately or unfortunately, I'll say, the affluent people are 30 to 50% higher chance of voting in a local election. People that are well educated, much more likely to vote in a local election. The white vote is 20% higher than the non-white vote. So what do you have at the end of the day? You have a bunch of smart, rich old people making up the rules that everybody else has to live by. And you know what? I don't know about you, but I don't think that's the way it ought to be. I think everybody ought to help make up the rules that everybody lives by. Well, why would this be? You know, what are some of the barriers to people going out and voting in a local election? Well, they don't have information, for one thing. They don't know the voting laws. And may I just say that there have been 400 new voting laws across our country since the 2020 presidential election. Every state but one has changes on the books that are making it more difficult for people to vote. So information is changing as we speak about that. People don't know about registration. They don't know when to vote or where to vote many times, or how to sign up to vote. Many of these people don't have the correct ID when it is time to go vote. Perhaps they have a translation issue, or they need assistance with voting. Perhaps they need transportation to the polls. Maybe this conflicts with their work hours and they have to have a job. And then what about these perpetual barriers of my vote does not count? Now, isn't that the saddest one you ever hear? But they look at the presidential election, which has so much media coverage, and they hear about the Electoral College and they see about some of these things and they think, well, you know, well, we've got to dispel that, because trust me, I've won some elections by the skin on my teeth. And so if everybody hadn't voted, you know, there would have been a different outcome. So there's lots of reasons, lots of barriers that people have for not voting locally. Well, I want to make my case here by telling you this. It's surprising, but we elect 500,000, that is 500,000 people, into local elected jobs in the United States. And guess what? These people control $2 trillion, $2 trillion with it. Local government can vastly impact of your lives. I mean, they deal with infrastructure and water. Think back to Flint, Michigan, and the problems with their water system. You know, they didn't haul out the senators and the governor and all of that. Of course, the governor appeared, but it was the local legislators that had dropped the ball on that. The city council and the county board and those people were not paying attention. Think back to Katrina. Who did we see over and over again on the TV? We saw the mayor of New Orleans, and they really were raking him over the coals for not doing his job with the levees and all of that sort of thing. So very, very important how these people affect our quality of life. And this ought to get all of us on this call excited, because now most municipalities and cities have what's called a climate action plan. Now, that is the whole reason that we are meeting today, to think about what to do as a group to enhance dealing with the climate issues. Well, the climate action plan deals with building and energy, land use and urban form, transportation and fuels, consumption, materials management, natural systems, and community well-being. So these are issues that are of great importance to us, and in solving some of this climate crisis, because you see, whatever they allocate in Washington in a huge package, it's going to come down to sooner or later state or local control over the implementation of that plan and the releasing of the resources. So we will not be able to get by with that. So what is a climate able to do, they can incentivize high quality and energy efficient buildings. They can plan for transit centered, walkable communities. They can adopt waste reduction strategies. They can incentivize zoning so that people can live closer to their work. And we don't think about that, but the distance that people travel to work is one of the single largest causes of emissions in our country. So a small change like that can make a huge difference, as it is copied again and again around our country. So the community, the citizens, the people need to be organized around climate change at the local level. City councils, mayors, county supervisors, these are the ones that we need to be working with in order to get some of these things done. Well, maybe you haven't considered the critical issues controlled by local elections. The states and local elections quite possibly will impact your life more than who becomes president of the United States, and faster. Not that that's not important. I'm not in any way trying to diminish on how important what happens locally is. Your city council will affect you more than the president of the United States, because you're going to have much more interaction with him or her and about the decisions that they make. Well, let's just stop and think for a minute. What represents local power? Well, school boards. I mean, the voting in school boards is so abysmal. I know most of you that are good citizens and vote in school boards, you know how pitiful it is. It is just absolutely unbelievable. And think about that. School boards have huge influence over our lives. They set policy. They hire and fire superintendents and teachers. They impact the equity of education in our community. Now, equity is different from fairness. They see that everybody gets the same thing, but they also see that people get what they need. They get what they need for an education. So treating everybody just alike is most often the most unfair thing you can do. So not fairness, but equity. What about sheriffs, criminal justice, law enforcement? They decide who can be arrested. They execute warrants. They determine cooperation with ICE. And if you live in a community that has a great deal of Hispanics and immigrants, you know that is huge to see how your sheriff is going to deal with that sort of thing. They set policies for force and how that's going to be used in your community. What about prosecutors? My goodness, they decide on felonies and misdemeanor charges. They have many level of courts that they work in: municipal, criminal, family, juvenile, all of these sorts of things. They can decide whether a juvenile is going to be tried as an adult or not. Now, of course, those laws come down from the state to them, but still they have jurisdiction over a lot of those things. What about your mayors and your city councils? Governance of cities and municipalities is so very important. They deal with all the budgets, all the boards and commissions, and many times they're appointed if they're not elected. They deal with police, fire, sanitation. I mean, all of these things come under our local mayor, city council, whatever your form of government is. So just huge. Now, as I was on the quorum court for many years, people thought, the quorum court, that is so ridiculous. They have no clue the power that a legislative body county has and what we have to deal with and what happens, and whether or not your house is going to be covered by FEMA. If you determine that you're going to build in a floodplain no matter what, well, okay. You try to talk sense into some of these people. It's not always easy. So, lots and lots of jurisdictional power there. The Planning and the Zoning Commission. Oh my word. We are fighting them in Fayetteville, Arkansas 24/7 because they think every piece of ground that is usable should be commercial. So, you have to really be working with them all of the time. So when we stop and think about it, a tremendous amount of our lives and our potentially well-being rest in the power of local government. So in our city right now, in our state too, there's a big deal that's going to be on our ballot about expanding the jails. Well, you know what? We don't want to do that, a lot of us, because Arkansas already incarcerates more people than many small countries, and our crime level continues to go up. So bigger jails is not the answer, but our quorum court is very much in favor of this. And so usually in elections, we've been focusing on, our state and federal more. No, we are on it for our quorum court members, and most of them are up for re-election. And so we have spent a huge amount of time trying to get people to run, and hopefully they can win, that support our ideas about criminal justice and incarceration. And where did I become so concerned about incarceration? Well, of course, as a social action chairman for United Methodist Women and being immersed in the school to prison pipeline for the last 3 years, we know this, and resource officers, which sometimes cities decide about that in the schools. You got to pay attention to these things. They're very, very important. So what can you do? Find out how these people that are running for office feel about things that are important to you. Does it go with your ethics and your morals and your belief system and what you're working so hard as United Women in Faith to accomplish? You don't want to vote on somebody that doesn't support that. You can encourage others. I bet you I'm right now today to the best group of citizens that you could find anywhere, and you're saying, is this woman crazy talking to me about local elections? Well, if you're already bought in and you already do it, then get off of this call when it's over and call your neighbor or call somebody across town or somebody and say, hey, I'm fired up. We've got to start voting locally. I'll drive you down there, whatever. Get people excited about this. It's important. Ask how you might help. Maybe people are embarrassed or ashamed that they don't understand about these systems. And if you're their friend, they might feel comfortable asking you about it, and you can talk to them about it. The other thing you can do is you can attend these meetings. You're probably not going to go to a congressional meeting, but you, or maybe even to the Capitol. It was hard this year with the pandemic. I know I sat inside of my kitchen and watched many of the committee meetings at I was really concerned about the Stand Your Ground bill. I was opposed to it. So for 3 hours, I sat in my kitchen and watched that committee meeting and watched it, of course, go down in flames. But I thought, someone to say, girl, you need to get life if you're sitting in your kitchen for 3 hours watching a committee meeting. But, it was important to me. So you can attend these meetings. You can contact local people. You know where to find them. You can drive over to their house and say, hey, guess what? I voted for you. Let me talk to you about this. So I really want to encourage us to spend less time criticizing and more time organizing, getting things together to go and visit and talk and write and do all these things we need to do to get our cities and our counties working in the way that they need to be working. And listen, don't be fooled by politics on these issues. I told you I wasn't going to name my party, and I'm not, because you know what? We do not breathe and drink Democratic air and water. We do not breathe and drink Republican or libertarian air and water. No, we are all in this together. These are things that are critical for life anywhere you go, everywhere you go. And so we need to fight these things together as citizens who want to make this world a better place and want to make it more like the kingdom that we talk about at Mission U and other places that God intended for us to be. So, he left Adam, and then it trickles right on down to us to be in charge of all this stuff. And that's what I think we're trying to do. So we've got to work together. Well, there's a couple of websites. One I'm just going to tell you about, and one I think I'm going to have some help in showing you that I discovered. One is for the League of Women Voters. They're a tremendous organization, and they really, really push voting, and they work on behalf of women. They're very issue oriented. And I put these in the chat. You can go to vote 411.org, VOTE 411.org, and you will see a tremendous amount of help and information and topics and issues that you can get excited about and involved in. And many of them are handled at the local level. So I encourage you to go there. The other thing I encourage you to do is, I am so excited about what is being put up right now. And this is called Ballot Ready, and it's from the Thurgood Institute, Thurgood Marshall Institute, which, you know, that would be wonderful. And let's see, whoever's helping me, let's just try this. Let's put my address in there. It's preparing my ballot. It's going to be my ballot that I'm going to see on November the 8th, starting with the federal all the way down. So if you'll just click on U.S. Senate, and let's see what that says right there, U.S. Senate. Now, for each of these, it's going to give the pictures of who's running, what party they're running under, and a little bit of a blurb about their particular job. So that's for our U.S. Senate in Arkansas. One of our senators is up for re-election, so we have a choice about that. Now, I will just tell you that it does that for every one of these, but let's just go down to local, because that's what we're talking about. Okay, Washington County Judge, you can just click on that for me. That is up for election. Those are our two people. I know Josh Moody very well, and I know about Patrick Deakins. And so this tells a little bit about the county judge, and you see a picture there, and it's going to be on your ballot. And then you can just drop down to each one of the categories that's going to be on that ballot. The clerk, Becky Llewellyn is unopposed, but she is going to be on the ballot. And then just go all the way down, You can see even to a constable. Now that is a very, it's not inconsequential, but it's not something that people usually stay awake at night worrying about unless they are one. But I think this is just tremendous that you can put your address in there and it will show up your entire ballot from federal all the way down to the local candidates, to give you an opportunity to see who these people are and what they are supposed to do. So I think this is very, very exciting, and I wanted to be able to share this with you. Okay, thank you so much for showing that. Well, for my closing, I'm going to have Ilka play a little song for me, and I want to do a little bit of, what do they call it, disclaiming. This song is by Willie Nelson. Now, I'm sure we all know Willie, and I grew up in Texas, so, I've heard of him forever. And typically, I do not use Willie in anything spiritual or anything like that, but I've got to use him on this because of this song. And I want to give him a little cover, because he'll say in here something about the ballot box. But Abraham Lincoln said, the ballot is stronger than the bullet. And John Lewis, who I just absolutely adore, he's the late civil rights leader and congressman from Georgia. He said, the vote is precious. It is the most powerful, non-violent tool that we have in a democratic society, and we must use it. So I want you to think about that as we listen to Willie's song. Okay. Well, there's a lot of wisdom in that song. If you vote them out, but I would tell you to vote. Don't leave your
Thank you so much, Brenda, for the fabulous resources that you have shared with us, the encouragement and the reminder to respond to your civic duties and do less criticizing and more organizing. A very important reminder also that we should not just be thinking of voting every 4 years, but that local elections are very important for quality of life, for climate action plans, are very important for our campaign in particular, but for quality of life in general, right? For our schools, for the many areas of services and law enforcement that we require. So vote them in or vote them out, but vote. So great reminder of that. And I think that's a great transition as well for our next speaker, Gayla Tillman. They are an organizer and born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia. And they have taught trainings and helped host events centering an array of social justice issues. Give a little bit of for her presentation to come up as I'm introducing Gayla. Maybe we could take just a sec. As we're transitioning out. Thank you, Huck, in advance for putting Gayla's photo up. Maybe I'm not able to see it, so let's continue working. Gayla is a former, has had a former role at Georgia Conservation Voters, and they were the civic engagement organizer there. They've also worked in the intersection of environmental justice and civic engagement, which is very important as well as we're centering our efforts. And they have worked towards energy equity and justice, clean energy, and accessible climate solutions. As policy associate, Gayla has worked on, they have looked on making policy creation and decision-making processes more accessible for people of color as well, working class and marginalized genders as well. So I want to welcome Gayla and see if we can the hot spotlight on. There you go. Thank you, Gayla. Thank you.
Thank you for this introduction. But also, if I need to share my slides, I'm happy to do so also.
Yes, that would be wonderful. Do you have sharing capabilities?
Yes.
Wonderful.
That would be great. I think I'm having some weather issues over here.
I appreciate you, Hawk. I appreciate you.
Sorry about that.
So can you guys see my screen okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Okay, so I think my presentation kind of like shores up pretty well after like the previous one. I really appreciate everything that you said, Brenda, because like I really want to dive deeper into what it means for us to communicate our values at the ballot box and what that means at the different levels of government and why that is so significant for like our day-to-day. So my presentation is protecting our common home through voting. And of course, I work for Georgia Interfaith Power and Light. So a little bit about us for folks who do not know us is that we engage communities of faith in stewardship of creation as a direct expression of faithfulness and as a religious response to global climate change, resource depletion, environmental injustice, pollution, and other disruptions in creation. And so we have congregations across the entire state of Georgia and registered green teams. Green teams are like 3 people or more that gather together to advocate or, work towards some form of sustainable action. And so we have about like 100 of those all over the state. And we are a part of the National Interfaith Power and Light movement. So we're the Georgia affiliate, but of course there are other state affiliates. And so today I'm going to be talking about our Faith Climate Justice Voter Campaign. This campaign focuses on engaging and mobilizing faith voters to communicate their values of caring for our common home and loving our neighbors through voting. So back in 2020, Interfaith Power and Light, our national organization, did some voter outreach to increase turnout, in which they were able to do, and increase turnout for those contacted by like 1.7%, which may seem small, but as Brenda was saying, like every vote matters, every vote counts. And so whether that be the local level, the state level, the federal, all of it matters. And so that's why it's really significant for us as people of faith, faith leaders, et cetera, to really witness. It's not enough for us to see what's going wrong in our communities and be passive about it. Like there are many ways that we can empower each other in our communities at large to be active in terms of progressing to protect the planet. And so I'm going to play a quick video. This video features Hermina Glasshill, who now works for Oceana. She is an incredible ocean conservation advocate, but also like very involved in the faith community in Savannah, Georgia, which is on our coast. And this really kind of like captures what exactly is the connection of climate / like sea level rise and the role of faith communities.
Truth is a lonely place, but it is the only place. If we don't deal with truth, what you're going to end up having is the fiction that has brought us to the place to where democracy right now is in jeopardy.
The communities here on the coast are Black, Indigenous, and people of color who are on the front line of the impact of climate change, particularly here in Brunswick, where there is a tremendous amount of flooding that results from tropical storms, sea level rise, and they are experiencing these impacts at alarming rate.
September of last year, and we had an unusual rainy day. And yes, we're on the coast, so high tide plus rain means flooding. And we probably had about maybe 3 feet of water that was just standing here in this area. And in light of what we experienced last year and what it cost us here, we decided that we want to do our part in trying to protect what we have here. And so we started boarding up the holes in which the water can infiltrate underneath the structure and put sandbags up. And so that if we can't have the structures in place that will protect us, we have to protect ourselves. But everybody can't afford sandbags. Everybody can't afford to always move away or protect themselves when flooding happens. Some people have lived in this particular city all their lives. Can't afford to go anywhere else. And they can barely afford to stay where they are. And those are the people who really need the funding to come in to improve the area and the conditions in which they live.
This is where these winding roads have led.
I don't think that people even recognize that climate change is a spiritual destruction, and we have transferred faith into fear. If you ain't got no courage, you ain't got no faith. And if you ain't got no faith, you ain't got no God. And that's what's done happened to us.
I will rise up. I will not fall.
Churches have dug real deep into their coffers and are meeting the needs of communities that are being impacted by climate change. I think that the federal government should be also investing in robust, rich, bold economic recovery as well as infrastructure.
This will be the day.
People don't want to do the new restorative jobs because it costs training. But I think we have to sort of take a step back and pause for a minute to say, but what is it costing us in the future?
But if we are to walk in the path that Jesus has set before us, perhaps we should let the idea of scarcity, we shouldn't let it stop us so easily.
As I referenced in my sermon today, that God can do amazing things with just a little bit, but we have to do our part as well.
Thinking that we don't have the time or the money or the energy might be self-limiting when we actually have access to much more than we can ever imagine.
I will stay strong, never giving up faith. I will go all the way. This will be the day.
So I really wanted to show that video because I really wanted to convey basically the spiritual and kind of like spiritual, the moral and spiritual grounding of like why we do this work and why it's so significant. Because if you get a call tomorrow, just like right now we're in September, we are in the, thick of hurricane season here in the Southeast. And so if you were to get the call tomorrow of someone saying like, hey, can I stay with you because my house got flooded, or like, hey, can you help because like, my car got lost to, a flood or something like that. I think it's really important for us as people of faith to be consciously thinking about when someone I love or someone in my community is in crisis, in what ways am I showing up? In what ways am I stepping in and, really showing support, like to them as an individual, but also helping combat what is the larger problems of why we're seeing these issues in our community. And so just kind of like diving a little bit deeper, because we're, Georgia IPL, we're based in Georgia, but I also think this applies like, all over the nation. So what we're seeing is like floods, extreme heat, and by extreme heat, like we're seeing historic numbers, whether that be like triple digits or just like periods of time where it's hotter than normal, like for over a course of like days, if not weeks. Sea level rise, so those really bad floods, and like, when you see those high water levels, flash drops, that's where flash drops and loss of crops and greenery is something that a lot of farmers and people who live in like South Georgia really struggle with, because us as Georgia, we're an agricultural state. And so when we don't have crops, people can't feed their families, people can't support their families. And so when we're thinking about these things, all of it's interconnected. And so it's up to us as people of faith to be thinking about, in what ways do I witness these things and do something about it? Just like recently in North Georgia, we experienced some really extreme rainfall. So that of course caused like, trees to fall and also like outages and things like that. But it's also just important to think about like how this is impacting creation, and how like destruction and depletion is not inherently natural to what we're seeing in the world. And so I really want to talk about our Faithful Voter Reflection Guide, because this voter reflection guide, is multi-issue because it's nonpartisan, but also in the guide, there are questions that you can ask to candidates to assess like what is their position. Because I think to the earlier point, we really want to make sure that people are voting on all forms of government. Like, you need to make sure that you feel like you can vote your values. You should be accountable. People should be accountable to how you feel in your community. And so that's why there's questions in there. There's some reflection. That voter guide was put out by National IPL, so it's not specific to like a specific like state or anything like that. And so I think it's just really important for us to have this guide, because it's important for us to understand that yes, we care about climate. Also, if you have a cousin that has asthma, that's also a health justice issue. Or if someone is struggling to bear children because of the pollution in their neighborhood, that's a reproductive freedom issue. And so like, it's really important for us as people of faith and moral consciousness to really be thinking about how these things are interconnected, and in what ways do we empower people to say, hey, elected official, this is how we feel, this is what we want to see in our neighborhood, whether that be the neighborhood or whether that be the state or even just federally. And I'll drop a link to the voter reflection guide. And so you may be asking, you just told us we should be doing something. What can we do? One of the first things that you can do is pledge to be a faith climate justice voter. I'll drop a link to that in the chat. That is one of the easiest ways that you can be a part of this movement. Because basically what happens when you pledge to be a faith climate justice voter is you tell people, hey, I'm going to go to the ballot box and communicate my values. You plant a tree. And what you do when you send this pledge to 10, 15, 20 other people is you help grow a forest. Because in order for us to really send the call, to really make the call of protecting our common home, we're going to need people. We're going to need, a massive amount of people. And so if there's anything that you can do, I would say pledge to be a faith climate justice voter. And then there's also other campaigns that we're working on. So we have a letter writing campaign. So if at any point you want to write letters urging people to, vote in the upcoming elections, we have that. We also have text banks that are coming up, because you'd be surprised how many people forget where their polling location is, or, forget when early voting is. There's a lot of things to remember about voting, and even more things to remember in the state of Georgia, just because we have a lot of voter restrictions. And so those text things not only remind people about voting and like help communicate our values, but also, you can be very, assistive to someone who may not have like, all the resources necessary to, go to the ballot box. And so we're also asking folks to add this to their campaign like bulletin. Like if you have a newsletter that goes out, or if you just have something that like you kind of like hang up on like in the congregation or something like that, we're asking folks to share this information, because the more reminders about voting and about why it's significant to vote, the better. And then of course, last but not least, I said this earlier, but sending this pledge to 10 people and asking them to do the same, because I feel connected to someone if they were to ask me to do something that they feel is in alignment with my values. And I feel like you would be able to do the same if you were able to send the pledge. And then I wanted to talk about like what our votes do, because like there's a lot of conversation about like, oh, I should pledge, this, that, and the third. And like, I just want to talk about like what specifically. And so this was touched on earlier, but like our elected officials are accountable to us to have just and fair communities. So if you notice in your community, there's no sidewalks. So there's all kinds of car accidents from people like walking in the street or something like that, or you notice it's very expensive for you to get to work or something like that because there's not a lot of transportation. There's a lot of ways that climate impacts our communities on a day-to-day basis, especially if you're someone with high energy bills or high utility bills in general. And so those are ways that we can hold our elected officials accountable, because those things aren't just something that just happens to us. They can happen with us. And so federally, we were recently able to pass the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the largest climate investment in American history. And so if you signed a petition or sent a letter or sent a call or anything, did a phone call or anything like that to help pass that, I want you to give yourself a pat on the back, because that is the largest investment we've seen in American history. And I know for a fact there will be children of tomorrow and in the future who care very deeply that we took the steps now to make sure that our elected officials knew that climate can't wait. And so also we have another campaign coming up called Solutions for Pollution. Essentially, the Biden administration has to abide by the Clean Power Rules. That's a bunch of words for saying like cutting emissions. And so we cut emissions by making sure that we reel in these industries and how much they emit, and like, making sure the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, is setting rules that are protecting our communities. And so that's a campaign that we're working on. If folks would like to learn more, I can drop a link to that in the chat. And then in terms of what's happening on state and local levels, so locally here in the state of Georgia, Georgia Power, our largest utility, was tasked with developing 2,300 megawatts of new renewables, which may seem small. However, every chance that we get closer to a renewable, harm-free energy source is better than, the traditional gas and oil and things like that. And also more energy savings and energy efficiency programs, because as we saw in Texas with that ice storm, it's really significant for a community to have energy efficiency, structure. Because it's one thing to tell someone, oh, turn your AC to like this temperature or do this thing. It's also really important for people to have the infrastructure to protect themselves from an ice storm or any other, event that is not typical from, that region. And so last but not least, I want to talk about like locally, like what's really significant, because as we see like floods and ice storms, they're kind of like these different weather events that we're not used to. It is up to our local officials to step up and say, oh, this is what we're going to do about this. For example, if your water, whether it be Flint or what's happening, locally in your neighborhood, if your water is experiencing like a sewage spill or something like that, and there has to be, some updates to that water, it is up to those local officials, to notify you and make sure that citizens are notified of when there are problems with the water quality. And also just like any ways that people engage with utilities. Like, for example, here in the state of Georgia, our utility is Georgia Power, which, yes, is investor owned. But also we have a public service commission. Those are regulators that are supposed to advocate with us as citizens, as residents of Georgia, for just energy, for equitable energy. And so I think it's while also balancing Georgia Power's profits, though, like the core part is that they're the Public Service Commission. And so I say all of this is that our elected officials have a lot of power, and we as people have a lot of power to demand better for our communities. Because every day that I see a child with asthma, every day that I see someone struggling with a heart condition or something like that because of the pollution in our city, I think about the powers that I have to change that. I don't want to ever be in a place in which I'm relying on something else to empower me to do something in my community. And so that's why I care a lot about this campaign and making sure that I'm a voter, making sure that everyone in my family and my friends and things like that are engaged, because these things matter and they can be a matter of life or death. And so I'm going to pause because I would love it if everyone on this call could take a moment to take the pledge to be a faith climate justice voter. You are a person of faith. You are someone that cares very deeply about these issues, because if you weren't, you wouldn't be on this call. You will certainly wouldn't be listening to me. So I would love if everyone could take a second to take this pledge. You can scan it on your phone, or you can go to the Bitly link, or you can text faith voter to 72572. Whichever is most convenient for you, though I just wanted to take a pause because I love if folks could just really be in the movement with me, because I've taken the pledge and I hope you'll join me. So I'll give that a second. Also, I need to pull up the chat. It's case sensitive, so if you put in like all caps, it might not work, just FYI. And then if at any point you're just like, wow, that was a lot of words, how do I keep up? We have social media. And so soon we're going to be releasing videos on our YouTube about featuring other faith leaders that like to talk about the intersection of faith, climate, and justice and voting rights. Also on our Facebook, we have an annual Coffee and Something Stronger. Our director interviews, either a faith leader or a really amazing community leader to talk about something climate related. And then our Instagram is Twitter, is like how you keep up with updates. If you're just like very curious about other, climate issues that are happening in Georgia and you want to know how to take action, feel free to follow us there. Here's my face. I'm just joking. If you have any questions or anything like that, because I know we're Georgia focused, but also like if you have like questions in general, feel free to reach out to me. My email is gala@gifl.org. And then if you're very curious about other classes that you may be able to request, just like that class that talks specifically about like what is the role of faith leaders in protecting creation, like that's a class that you can request. You can go on our website and learn more. And that's all. So I really appreciate y'all allowing me to talk more about the guys and about why it's so significant for us to be faith climate justice voters, or even just, engage in voting rights at all. I think it's really important, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk more about it. So stop sharing screen. There we go.
Thank you so much, Gayla. I really appreciate your insights, and we'll have Q&A at the end with you. So if you have any questions for Gayla, please feel free to write them in the chat, or we'll make some space as well for people to unmute themselves later. So thank you, Gayla, for reminding us of the power that we have and that our elected officials have to address some of these challenges that we're facing that are aggregated by the climate crisis, right? Some, like the water crisis that we're seeing in Mississippi right now, right? And the responsibilities that our faith communities have to engage to respond to this climate crisis, not only addressing those humanitarian needs that are very important, but also thinking more structurally and engaging with our elected officials and in the electoral process as well, as a way of showing support and showing off and connecting climate justice with gender justice, racial justice, and thinking critically really about how we're exercising our power to vote. And so with that being said, I'm going to show now a little bit more about how we can do as United Women in Faith and organize in these spaces. And if you're still filling out your forms to pledge, I just filled mine, and we would also share the link later on in our resources so that more people can pledge to vote. This is very important, as Brenda said, and I'll be sharing more as well as to why it's important that we do these pledges, and not only for ourselves, but that we encourage other members as well to join. And I hope Huck and show my slides now, but let me know, because I know she had been having some strong winds where she is, so the connection is going in and out. But let me know, Hawk. I'll give you a little bit of time while I'll also look at my notes, or I'll be able to share screen. Can you hear me there, Hawk?
Yes, I can, and I am trying to share.
Let me know if you need to share anything on my end.
So sorry about this.
It's fine. Weather issues, as we're talking about climate change, it fits just right. And thank you, everyone. I appreciate the patience as we're dealing with this technical difficulties. But there we go.
I have to do it a little differently. Let's see if it'll go here. But this was the slide we were supposed to show. I'm so sorry, Kayla. But we are good to go. We're just going to do it.
No worries. I appreciate y'all.
All right, you're good to go.
Wonderful, thank you. And so I'll be telling you a little bit more about how we can, again, engage as United Women in Faith in our organizing spaces. And so kind of to recap on what Brenda and Gayla were sharing, and why it's so important that we're keeping in mind this midterm elections, because there's a lot in stake, right? We have 435 House seats that are being held for election. We have 35 out of the 100 Senate seats that are also on the ballot. And 36 out of 50 states will be electing governors. So actually very important elections that are coming up, so keep those in mind. Not to speak about the other local elected positions as well. Also important to keep in mind that this will be the first election after the redistricting from the 2020 census, and so plan in advance for where you'll be voting, and also just in general, there's been changing rules as to what the different states' regulations for voting will be, so keep those in mind as well. Thankfully, earlier this year, the Supreme Court passed an order favoring voters that challenge election rules. So just try to familiarize yourself with some of these rules and know how they may affect disproportionately some of the people in your state. And so have that as a resource, and you can reach out on organizations that can provide you more resources on how to make some of those challenges if you are in one of those states that are being affected by these rules. And so more generally speaking, some of our action asks for United Women in Faith members is, well, first of all, we're going to ask you all to register, check if you're registered to vote. This is very important. If you haven't voted in a few years, or if you're not sure if it has expired or not, it's still active, you can check in your local elections department. Sometimes they have a website where you can also enter your information, and they will tell you if you're registered or not to vote. You can also ask your family members and friends to check. And then also keep in mind that depending on the state, you might have a different window on when you're able to, up until when you're able to register to vote. Some deadlines are 30 days before the election, others are 15 days, some others are up to election day. In Texas, if you're there, you have up until October 11th to register to vote. So important to keep those in mind as we're trying to register ourselves and our friends and family to vote. So please familiarize yourself with those deadlines, as they do vary. As Gail has shared, pledging to vote is also very important. And if you just filled that form for being a faith, climate, justice voter, thank you so much for filling out that pledge. And it's important because it helps us get reminders, and also it gets us some information sometimes about candidates. There will be different resources out there that different organizations that get out the vote do. And so it's a great way to get information about candidates in your area, and then also help organizations like us mobilize better for those get out the vote efforts. And if you want to do a little bit more and also help others access voting, you can become a voter registrar or deputize, and you can help people by distributing registration forms, helping them, giving you those registration votes, perhaps assisting people also with completing the forms, and you can invite others as well to pledge, and offering rights to the polling places as well. Remember that there's early voting, and that's a great way sometimes to avoid some of the difficulties of long lines on election day that will be coming up November 8th. So also an important day to keep in mind, and find out for the voting, early voting period as well in your area. So just different ways that you can also help others access voting, get familiar with the polling places and whatnot. But then also remember that we have to show up and vote, vote our values and our faith. But then also it doesn't end with our civic duties, don't end with voting, right? We have to engage with elected officials, send messages, letters, emails. We can call them. We can do constituent visits. We can attend town halls. We can attend legislative events like United Women in Faith have. I love attending mine in Texas, and I encourage you to attend one in your states. And there's great resources as well. If we can go to the next slide. Thank you. If you're wondering, well, I'm receiving a lot of people in my congregation, they don't know if we should be engaging and mobilizing to get out the vote. The General Board of Church and Society has great resources where you can learn more about what churches can and cannot do. And these are some just helpful examples that you can take a look. Of course, if you are hosting an elected a candidate, you have to make sure you're offering the spaces for both parties, right? You cannot have, or for all equal parties, you cannot have preferences for either for fundraising or reduced prices, any of the sorts. But you can have voter registration events. You can provide educational resources that are not partisan. You can welcome, as I say, public or candidates in public forums, as long as every candidate is invited to participate. And you can also encourage or support issues or policies that are important for your community, right? And then also you can serve as a polling site. So just some important resources to take a look at if you're interested in also engaging more broadly with your church community, and to what we can or we cannot do in our churches and congregations. And then next, we can also take a little bit more of a look at the substance, right? And some of those asks that we'll be doing to the candidates to see more about like what issues do they support. I think it's very important that we familiarize ourselves with the legislation. If they have a record of legislation that they have passed, very important that as we're establishing those relationships with candidates and elected officials, that we're familiar with the legislation that they pass, and that we try to also show voter faith, right? And familiarize ourselves with our priorities. So as United Women in Faith, we know that we've always worked in responding to the needs of women, children, and youth. And every 4 years, we identify a specific focus for advocacy in addition to our ongoing work for gender, racial justice, and for oppressed and dispossessed communities. And so right now, we have 2 ongoing campaigns, our Just Energy for All campaign that I'm leading, and our campaign for ending mass incarceration and criminalizations of communities of color, as well as the school to prison pipeline that Emily is leading our efforts there, right? We also are working hard to hold our government accountable for the Justice 40 initiative that it launched to ensure that some of the investments that are going towards renewable energy, for instance, the IRA, are also going for investments in frontline communities, right? At least 40% of those investments that we're seeing in green renewable energy, we as United Women in Faith, we very strongly advocate that they're going to frontline communities of those that are the most impacted and are in the most need of a just transition. And as part of that faithful voter guide that Gail has shared with us, these are some of the key points as well that you can find in that voter guide. And we, United Women in Faith, are also endorsers of that voter guide. And So we do encourage you to take a look. And some of those issues, it's very important that we highlight our responsibilities of protecting God's creation and our sacred earth, building an economy of inclusion, protecting everyone's health, pursuing restorative and racial justice, and creating a more peaceful world, just as some of the key spaces to highlight, right, as areas of concern that we want to make sure that we're holding candidates accountable for, and that we're thinking through as well as we're making our minds about who we're voting and who we're supporting. Next, I just want to share a quick overview of some strategies that we can do, right? So thinking location is very important, right? Is your state a blue state, a red state, a purple state? That will determine your strategy on how you engage with those candidates and in your organizing strategy as well with your community. And familiarizing yourself again with that language is very important as you're thinking through the candidates and what they've supported in the past or not, trying to use a language that is familiar for them as well, but that does show your values and our values as United Women in Faith is also very important. So being strategic about those things and our positionalities as well are very important in how we're showing allyship and voting or values, right? Pledging to vote, as we said, is a great way to get a reminder, and then also a great way to show our values, helping others to access voting and continue engaging after the elections, right? Whoever gets elected, we have a responsibility to hold them accountable, right? They're public servants. Regardless of what party they are, what agenda they run with, they are accountable as they are elected officials. They are accountable to everyone who elected them, right? So make sure we take our power, we realize what power we have, like Ayla said, and we actually try to hold them accountable by participating in the various forms that we can engage with elected officials. And lastly, I just want to highlight again some of that toolkit, those toolkits and resources. Oh, I think we had for some of those resources, so that we'll be sharing at the end, so you can also access them. Now I want to just leave the floor for some Q&A, because I'm sure you guys have questions for our speakers, and I'll be looking in the chat, and also feel free to unmute yourself if you would like to jump in and share your question by voice. Checking the chat. If you have any questions for any of our speakers, feel free to drop them in now, and I'll be going through our chat to read any of them. Yes, this video will be made available to share it later. We'll be sending out an email within a week or so, so that people can have access to it, as well as the links and any resources that were shared or talked about. What was the previous slide? Hawk, if you can go to the previous slide. Thank you. And I guess I do have a question. Maybe I can. I guess my first question will be for Brenda, as we can get some other people asking in their questions. Brenda, what, I guess, when was the first time that you ran? Remind us when it was, and how did you feel? Was it someone that invited you? Someone that told you, do you have great ideas, you should consider running for office? Was it like a personal moment of reflection? What was that special call that you had to run for office?
Well, the special call that I had, I ran for school board, and both of my children were in special ed. One had diagnosed learning disabilities and 3 other handicaps, and the other one was there through 504 with a hearing discrimination. And so I had to learn the public law 94142 and had served on learning disabilities of Arkansas and made myself very knowledgeable about the law as it pertained to children and their education. And of course, you have to be an advocate. I mean, just 24/7. And I have training as a school teacher. So Anyway, I saw how complex it was and how difficult it was for teachers, because back in that day, we did not have all the differentiations of learning disabilities that we do now, like autism and, Asperger's and, this, that, and the other. So anyway, I decided that if learning the law was important, that making the law could also be very, very important if you had a special area of expertise or knowledge or challenge. So I ran for school board, and it was a dramatic election. I had two opponents, and I got in a runoff. Almost didn't even have to have a runoff. I had 50.1% of the vote out of three people, but had to be in a runoff. And it was amazing that I was able to lose. The newspaper wrote letters about, they said, no one has a 900 vote lead going into a runoff and loses. But they is their terms, there was some slime in the ice machine. And that's a Texas term that I think is pretty funny, although I read in Arkansas. But that was my first foray into politics. And I had a really burning desire to help not only my children, but other children that I felt like did not have parents who maybe were resourceful or who were knowledgeable about these sorts of things. So after I ran, I was really a terrible loser. I tell people this, and it only because it's true. It's very awful. But I would see people's obituary that had supported my opponent, and I'd think, well, good, they're gone. So that was a terrible thing for a Christian woman to think. So I said I would never even run for president of the Sunday school class after that. But because I had had a very outstanding campaign and election, I was asked to run for the quorum court. And I had to really think about that and pray about that, because, you show me a good, and it's not, they say, oh, it's not personal. Oh, it is personal, and it's all over the newspapers. And oh my goodness, yes, it is not fun. So I thought, oh, could I begin? But I decided that, that was probably a good thing. And my husband joined me in thinking, we need to do this together. And so anyway, I ran then and saw a much broader picture of what you can do as an elected official.
Thank you. And thank you for encouraging us also and making us realize that we can also run for office. If you don't like who you have in the ballot, it's an encouragement. It's a sign that you should be inviting folks who are considering to run yourself. We have a question by Miss Cynthia. What is the best way to get non-voters to become voters? And I'm going to ask Gayla to see if she wants to respond to that.
I think for me, really connecting to see what that person enjoys. I would say what that person enjoys, or what are some of the barriers that person may be experiencing. So for example, a lot of people may not know how directly connected elected officials are with our daily life. So for example, the example I was giving earlier was on a public service commission. So if that person has ever said, oh my goodness, my bill is so high, or oh my goodness, why is it so hot? The public service commissioners are the ones that are regulating our energy bills. It's something that's going to impact you on a monthly basis. Or if you're just oh my goodness, if I drive over another pothole, I'm going to lose it. Your mayor is the mayor, the city council, they're the ones who do that. If you're just why can't I get my kid into a good school? I just want my kid to have a quality education, regardless of where they're from. I just want my kid to have a good education, whether they'll be the Board of Education, also city council, how much money our local schools get. I think the ways to get people who don't vote to vote is just helping them understand how connected not only all of us are, but also understanding how these elected officials, these decisions impact us on a daily basis. Every single time that you think about almost everything in your life, it is impacted by someone making a decision about how we should navigate our city or our state or something like that. And so I think that's one element to it, but also just helping alleviate any barriers that person may be having to the ballot. Because I think some folks, if it's if it's too many things on the ballot, like they may become, you know, possibly like subconscious or something like that. Like because they just don't know all the candidates and they get worried that like, you know, they might vote for the wrong thing or something like that. Or, you know, their precinct is across town and they need support getting there and they don't want to be, you know, shamed for not voting, but it's still a barrier for them to get across town. So my answer to that is kind of like twofold, is that like, A, there are barriers that people are experiencing and we want to make sure we help alleviate those, but also just like really tapping into like, what is that thing that you hear that person talk about a lot? What is that thing that gets that person up in the morning? I think really connecting to that and having them understand that like, you know, all of this is interconnected, I think is really supportive in getting people to really go to the ballot box.
Thank you so much, Caroline. And I think that touches a lot, that makes a lot of sense and resonates with the importance of also building relationships and getting to know each other so that we can know what are some of those issues that speak to them, and we can engage in how to help better as well. So thank you so much, Brenda and Gayla. I really appreciate your insights and your encouragement to take action. And right now, I just want to close us with some few announcements before we close in prayer. How can help me sharing the screen real quick just to go a little bit of our upcoming programming and resources that we will have. And as we shared before, we'll be sharing this wonderful presentations as well. If Gayla, if you want to make available your presentation, we would also be sending that as well via email. So great, next slide. So if you are not getting our emails, please make sure you're checking your junk folder at climate justice at United Women, uwfaith.org, UnitedWomenInFaith.org, and mark it as not junk or not spam, and add it to your email list or contacts. So make sure you're getting all of our emails, because we also, in the next slide, we'll be sending out an action alert pretty soon to urge Congress to oppose an unjust pipeline deal. As we know, as part of the IRA, the Infrastructure Reduction, Inflation Reduction Act, sorry. There was some side legislation that was compromised to expand fossil fuel development and pipelines. And so we want to make sure that, you know, these investments that we're seeing in renewable energy don't come at the expense of frontline communities or in the expansion of fossil fuel that will lock us in worsening our climate crisis. And so if you have a time to text UWF No Pipeline to 52886, please do so, and we would also be sending the link later in the chat as well as in that email. Following, we would still have on the next slide our ongoing campaign, just asking for Congress to prioritize climate and justice legislation and funding, and with that language about following the Justice 40 initiative, as we shared, that is very important for us, and that's UWF Climate at the same number. We'd also be sending those links. Next slide. Yeah, we still have our postcard campaign for governors to invest in electric school buses. That's still active if you have access to that, and that would be sent afterwards. Next. We have Liz, our former Economic and Environmental Justice Executive and now Director of Mobilization and Advocacy. She will be speaking at a panel on the zero to zero solution, getting to actual zero anthropocentric emissions, and she will be presenting with Vision for Equitable Climate Action. We'll be sharing, it was shared already the link with some of that information on today's email about the webinar, but we'll be sharing more information as well, and that will be tomorrow. Next slide, please. And then just a general reminder for our working group and our monthly webinars. So the next working group for this webinar will be October 4th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And we'll be talking more about what we learned in this webinar, and then also how we can mobilize and engage our communities to get out the vote and share some of those resources that we shared here as well. And then our next upcoming monthly webinars will be October 19, November 16, and December we will not have a webinar, but we will have one working group as well. And then finally, we'll be sending out as well an evaluation of this webinar, and we want to hear from you on how we can support your work to advance just energy for all, and also if there's any specific topics that you would like us to cover. And now I'll invite Ms. Judy to close us. And Ms. Judy, she lives in Boise, Idaho, and has served as a district social action coordinator and is currently the Oregon-Idaho Conference Social Action Coordinator. So thank you so much for closing us in prayer, Ms. Judy.
Thank you. Let's pray. Gracious God, we give our gratitude to you for this beautiful world you have created. We ask for your guidance for us to be better stewards of the land, sea, and air. We recognize that if we want to see public policy that assures just energy for all, then we must step up to our responsibility of boldly participating in the public space. We ask for your presence to give us the courage to be advocates for climate justice. Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and I look forward to hearing more from you and that evaluation, and keep us and our elected officials in the coming elections in your prayers, and be prepared to be engaged to pledge and mobilize the vote. Thank you, everyone, again for attending and joining us, and thank you to our wonderful speakers for encouraging us to put our faith into action and engaging in the electoral process.